He was still sick. He could feel it in his legs and in the ache behind his eyes, and in the way the cold went straight through him now, as though his skin had been taken off. But he stood up straight on the porch boards, and he set the point of the sword to the wood and rested his weight on it in a way he hoped looked like ease rather than necessity, and he let his eyes move once, slowly, across the whole line of men in his yard before he spoke. "I'm only going to say this one time," he said. His voice did not shake. He was distantly grateful for that. "This woman is here by her own choice, and by her own right. She owes me nothing. I owe her more than I have any way to measure, including, as it happens, the fact that I'm standing here talking to you at all this morning instead of lying dead in my own barn." He let that sit a moment. "You rode onto my land once, and I let you ride off it again. You've come back a second time, in greater numbers, with borrowed law pinned to your coats to help you sleep afterward. There will not be a third time. You come onto this land again, with badges or without them, and there will be consequences I will not lose 1 hour of sleep over and will not apologize to any man for." He looked at the heavy man directly. "Go home," he said. "All of you. Go home." For a long moment, nobody in the yard moved at all. The wind came down off the mountains and moved through the pines and died away again. Somewhere a horse blew and stamped. The line of orc riders on the southern ridge sat their animals without a sound, and their silence was louder than any threat that could have been shouted, because it was the silence of people who were simply waiting, without heat and without hurry, to see which way the next moment would fall, and were entirely prepared for either. Then the heavy man turned his horse. He did it slowly, and he did it without a word, and he did not look at the ridge while he did it, which was its own kind of admission. His brother turned after him. The hard faces from the town went next. One and then another. The whole line of them coming apart the way such things always come apart once the first man has moved. The 2 riders with the borrowed badges went last of all. And they went last not out of courage, but because they were the only ones professional enough to understand that you never turn your back on a ridge full of armed men 1 heartbeat sooner than you must. Nobody said anything. There was nothing left for anyone to say. The whole party filed out of the yard and back onto the north road and rode away up it at a walk that wanted badly to be a gallop and could not be allowed to become one. The orc riders on the ridge waited. They waited until the last of the heavy man's party had cleared the far bend in the north road and dropped out of sight behind the trees. And then, without any signal the man could see, without ceremony, without a single sound carrying down across the frozen creek, they turned their shaggy horses as one and rode quietly back up into the dark folds of the mountains and were gone. And the ridgeline was only a ridgeline again, bare and white and empty against the winter sky, as though none of them had ever been there at all. The man stood on the porch a moment longer, and then his legs quietly informed him that they were finished for the day. He came back inside and sat down on the edge of the cot, because it was that, or fall down. She crossed the room and put the cup of bitter tea back into his hands, closing his fingers around it when they were slow to close on their own. "That was a foolish thing to do," she said. "Standing out there in the cold, sick as you are." "Probably," he said. "You could have sent me out to speak to them." "No," he said. "I couldn't." She looked at him a moment over the rim of her own cup, not with surprise, with the look of someone who has already seen a thing clearly and is only weighing whether this is the moment to say its name out loud. She did not say its name out loud. Not that day. What she did instead was sit down in the chair beside the cot and stay there through the rest of the afternoon, and make certain he drank the whole of the tea and ate something before the light went, and tend the fire at exactly the right level so that the room held its warmth all through the night while he slept the deep flattened sleep of a body knitting itself back together. He surfaced once in the middle of the night, the fire down to a low red glow, and she was still there in the chair, awake, her face turned toward the window and the dark beyond it. She did not know he had woken. He watched her a moment through the slit of his eyes, the strong, still profile of her against the dim light, and he understood that she was keeping a watch, that some part of her had not fully believed the men would not come back in the dark, and that she had decided, without a word to him, to sit up between him and the door until morning made it certain. He closed his eyes again and let the sleep take him back down, and he slept the rest of that night better than he had slept in years, for reasons he did not examine until much later. 2 days later, when he was well enough to sit outside for a little while in the pale, thin winter sun with a blanket over his shoulders, he asked her the thing he had been turning over since the moment he had first seen the riders sitting the southern ridge. How many of them were there, he said. On the ridge. Enough, she said. Then, because he kept looking at her, she went on. My father's friends, some of their sons. 2 of his cousins from the low camps. She paused. And his oldest student, a woman, who came the farthest of any of them to be here. Something crossed her face. She is better with the plants and the healing than I am. Better than I will ever be, if I am honest about it. She would have been his successor, in time, if he had stayed with the main band instead of going off alone the way he did at the end. He looked out at the southern ridge. From where he sat, he could still see the line the horses had cut into the deep snow along the top of it, a dozen sets of tracks coming down a little way off the ridge and then turning and going back up. Clean, decisive, no wasted motion. You could have told them to stay well back, he said. Told them you had it handled on your own. I thought about it, she said. At the start I did. Then I thought about your face that first afternoon, when the heavy man came the first time. The way you stood in the yard, between him and the door of your own house, and did not move. She looked at him steadily. And the way you are the kind of man who would stand there just the same, whether he was well or sick, and never once ask anyone for a thing. Never once. She turned her eyes back out to the ridge. My father used to say that a man who will not accept help cannot truly be helped, she said. He said it about the ones he treated, mostly the ones who fought him, who would not lie still, who would not admit where it hurt. A small motion at the corner of her mouth that was almost, not quite, a smile. But it applies more widely than to the sick. I have come to think it applies to nearly everyone, and it applies to you more than to most men I have known. He sat with that a while. The sun was thin and gave no heat, but the light of it was clean. What do I owe them? He said at last. The ones who came. There's a debt there now too, seems to me. Nothing, she said. You owe them nothing. They came because they chose to come, the same as I did. That is the whole of how it works among us. A thing given because it was chosen freely puts no debt on anyone. It is only the thing given grudgingly or taken that leaves a weight behind. What they did as free people, for the memory of a man they loved and for his daughter. You cannot repay that, and you are not meant to. You are only meant to let it have been given. He looked at her for a long moment. The winter sun was low and cold, and it lay across her face in a way the lantern light inside the house never quite managed, and it made every line of her clear and sharp, the broad, strong bones of her, the dark eyes the color of deep water under ice. He had known her, now, for 2 months, or near enough to 2 months. He had watched her work, and watched her grieve alone behind a shut door, and watched her save his life on a frozen morning without once losing the clear, cold center of herself. He knew the particular shape of her patience now. He knew the way she moved when she was certain of a thing, sure and unhurried, and the different way she moved when she was thinking her way toward certainty. He knew the difference between her silences, the silence that was peace, and the silence that was grief, and the silence that was only her turning a thought over and over until she understood it all the way through. He knew her. That was not nothing. That, he was beginning to understand, might in fact be very close to everything. And he had walked most of the way toward it, without ever once noticing his own feet moving. "You said you'd decide in the spring," he said. "I did say that. There's time yet. Spring's a way off." "There is some time yet," she agreed, "but I have been deciding since the first snow." Deciding is not always a thing that happens all at once, at the end. Sometimes it is a thing that happens slowly, a little every day, so that by the time the day comes to say it out loud, the saying is only a small thing, because the deciding is already long done. He did not ask her then what it was she had decided. He was not quite ready yet for that conversation, and she saw that he was not ready, and she let him have his time. The way you give room to a wild thing that is slowly, on its own terms, learning that it can trust a human hand. Not with pity, not with any kind of strategy or design, only with patience and with steadiness, and by simply going on being there, day after day, exactly as steady as she had been the day before. He had not, in all his life, come across anything quite like it before. And he understood, sitting there in the thin winter sun with the blanket over his shoulders and the cup going cold in his hands, that he had not known, before her, how badly he had needed it. The winter turned, the way winter finally always does. The worst of the deep cold broke and drew back up into the high peaks. The slopes of the mountains stayed white, but the great weight went out of the air, and there came a morning when the wind carried, underneath the cold, the first thin green smell of the spring that was coming. The ice went off the south sides of things first. Water began to move again under the frozen crust of the creek, and you could hear it if you stood still, a low secret sound running under the white. It was on a morning like that, with the coffee making its low noise on the stove and the gray light coming clean and early through the east window, that she told him she had made her decision. She told him she had decided to stay. Not through the season. Not to the spring and no further. Not in payment of any debt, because the debt, she said, had been paid many times over and was long behind them both. She had said, the morning she first walked into his house with a rifle pointed at her chest, that she would decide in the spring. Spring was very nearly here now. And she had decided. She told him at the table, in the plain early light, the way she said most things, without decoration and without waiting to be sure the moment was the right one. Because she had never in her life believed in waiting for the right moment when the true thing could simply be said. The debt is paid, she said, many times over. Whatever stays now, stays, because I choose it. Only that. He was quiet a moment. He was looking down at the table, at the grain of the old scarred wood under his hands, following it with his eyes the way a man does when he is trying to find the shape of a thing before he trusts himself to say it. Then he looked up at her. I don't know what I've got to offer you, he said. I want to be honest with you about that, because you've never once been anything but honest with me. I'm not a man with much to spare. This is a hard piece of land in a hard part of the world, and it takes more than it gives most years. I've got no money to speak of, no standing, no name that means anything past the bottom of that road. Nothing that would look like much of anything from the outside. From the outside, she said. Yes, I am not standing on the outside, she said. I have not been standing on the outside for a long time now. You keep speaking to me as though I am someone who rode up this morning to appraise the place and reckon what it's worth. I am not that person. I am the person who has lived inside these walls all winter, who has learned which board by the stove creaks and which of the dogs snores, who pulled you across 60 feet of ice with a rope because I could not stand the thought of the world with you gone out of it. I am asking from the inside. I have only ever been asking from the inside. He held her eyes for a long moment, and then, slowly, once, he nodded. That evening, when the sun was going down behind the mountains in long bands of hard, clean orange, and the air had gone to the kind of cold that no longer hurt, that only sharpened everything and made it clear. They sat together beside a fire he had built outside in the old ring of blackened stones near the fence. Not a cooking fire. The other kind. The kind of fire a man builds only to sit beside, with someone, when there is nothing that needs doing and nowhere either of you has to be. She had brought something out with her. It was the cord of carved bone beads, her father's cord. The same one the man had left on the old healer's wrist at the grave on the trail, months ago now, because leaving it had felt correct even though he had not known why. 2 of the riders had recovered it from the cairn when they came, she told him, and had carried it down out of the mountains and given it back into her hands when she first came to this place. She had kept it all winter, and never once spoken of it, and he had never known she had it. She held it a moment in her open hands, looking down at it in the firelight. The old beads were worn smooth and dark with all the years her father had worn them. Then she reached across and took his hand, and she wound the cord once around both their wrists together and tied it there. Not tight, just resting, just holding them loosely joined in the firelight. Among her people, she told him, this was how a binding was marked. The thing his people would have needed a priest and a book and a crowd of witnesses to make real. Her people marked it like this: a cord, a fire, no words. Because some things are too large to be trusted to words and too real to need any ceremony laid on top of them to make them so. He looked down at the cord where it joined them. Then he looked up at her. He turned his hand over slowly, under the beads, so that his palm was open and facing up. She laid her hand in it. Her hand was broad and strong and warm, and there were the small hard ridges of old work along the base of the fingers, and he closed his own around it and felt the whole winter close with it. All of it, the water on the trail, and the grave under its pale stones, and the cup of tea left cold outside a shut door, and the rope in the dark, and the 60 feet of ice, all of it drawing down at last into the single warm point of her hand, resting open in his. They sat there like that in the firelight, with the great dark shapes of the mountains standing over them, and the cold hard stars coming out one at a time overhead, and neither of them said anything at all for a long while, and the fire burned down low, and they did not move to build it up, and they did not move to go in. Later, inside, he would make the drink her way, the way that had somehow become their way over a long winter of small mornings. She would sit at the table while it steeped on the stove. The dogs would settle themselves heavily on the warm stones. The lantern would throw its familiar yellow light across the old boards of the floor and the walls, and the whole room would feel exactly as it had always felt, and also, at the very same time, completely and permanently different. And there would be no way at all to explain that to anyone who had not been there to feel it for themselves. There is a particular thing that happens, once in a very great while, when 2 people out of 2 separate worlds that were built and warned and taught to stay well apart from one another, discover that they fit together anyway, without asking anyone's permission first. It is not a loud thing. It announces nothing. It does not ride into town to be seen. It does not ask the valley for its approval, or wait for the right season, or sit down and calculate the odds against itself before it dares to grow. It simply grows, the way grass grows up through solid stone, patient and stubborn and quiet, finding the light through whatever small crack in the rock it is offered. Because growing toward the light is the only thing it has ever known how to do. He had stopped on a lonely trail for a dying stranger he did not know and could not understand, because the reflex to stop was in him and had nowhere else in all the world to go. He had given water, and a strip of his own shirt, and a share of his own warmth, and he had sat in the dark beside a creature not of his kind, and asked for nothing in return, expecting nothing, because that was simply who he was when no one at all was watching. and she had walked a long, hard way across cold and dangerous country to honor what that had meant among her people. She had come by her own choice, which is the only way that any of it ever holds. She had stayed at first for a debt, and then she had stayed because the man she had found at the end of that debt turned out to be worth the staying, and she was not a woman who confused duty with desire, or ever once mistook the one for the other. The debt her father's spirit had carried out of the world had been paid back in full long before the cord was ever tied. What the two of them built after that was not a debt, and it was not a reward, and it was not a rescue or an obligation or a fine gesture made for anyone else to see and approve. It was two people at a kitchen table in a stone house at the edge of the world, making the morning drink together in the cold, and choosing, each day, quietly, without any fuss about it, to keep on showing up for one another. That was enough. In the end, that was everything. Outside, the mountains stood exactly where they had always stood, indifferent and enormous and older than any grief or any joy that had ever passed beneath them. And the high country spread away in every direction under the stars without apology and without end. And somewhere off along the southern ridge, in the first gray light, the wild horses were moving, and the water ran on under the ice, and the world went on turning in its own old way, caring nothing for any of it. The only thing in all of it that had changed was everything. If this story stayed with you, even a little, do the one small thing that helps more like it reach more people who need them. Leave a like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.
Aran glanced toward the corner of the room where Nessa slept in the unfinished cradle. The one Brauld had started and never completed. That one is filled now, he said. Gruka said nothing, but her hands stopped moving over the beans, and for a moment the only sound in the kitchen was the crackle of the fire and the slow breathing of a sleeping child. A few days later, something small happened that carried more weight than any repair Doran had made. The leftover bread from the previous night still sat untouched on the table. Aran had not taken it. He had not hidden it in his pocket or pressed it against his body. For the first time since Selah died, the boy had gone to sleep, believing the food would still be there when he woke up. Doran stood beside the table for a long moment, looking at that piece of bread with an expression that had nothing to do with bread. Then he breathed out slowly, the way a man does when something he has been carrying for months finally sets itself down. The following week, Olga Ashbone rode in from the eastern ridge. She was the oldest orc woman in Grimfang Valley, a widow 3 times over whose word moved between clans the way water moves between stones. She brought fresh goat's milk and quiet news. A trader passed through Drock's camp. Says he recognized your human. Claims the man is a deserter from the border infantry. After Olga left, Gruka said nothing for the rest of the day. That night, after the children were asleep, she sat across from Doran and placed both hands flat on the table. Tell me what happened with your company. Doran met her eyes without pretending to be surprised. My unit was hit from 2 sides on Alder Ridge. The line broke. Most were killed in the first hour. I carried 2 wounded soldiers down the ravine and walked for 3 days to reach a supply post. By then, the regiment had listed everyone as lost. I was never charged, but I was never cleared either. He paused. I did not run, but I cannot prove that to anyone who was not there. Gruka studied his face. What you did here speaks louder than what happened on a ridge I have never seen. But if Drock finds a way to use this against you, he will. I need to know whether you intend to stay long enough for it to matter. I am still here. That was all either of them said. But the careful distance that two cautious people maintain when they are not yet sure what they are building grew a little smaller that night. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this story, we'd love for you to join the Orkheart Saga family. Hit subscribe, tap the bell so you don't miss part 3, and drop a comment telling us which moment has stuck with you most so far. Your support means everything to us. 2 days later, Olga returned with her 3 grandchildren, 2 orc boys with practice tusks on their belts, and a girl already broad in the shoulders. They found Iran working alone beside the hay crib, measuring gaps with his wooden stick. The older boy grinned. "What are you counting? Soft tooth? Too small to lift a hay bale." Aaron did not look up. 8 fingers. "He talks to the hay," the younger one said. The girl pushed past them and crouched beside Aaron. She watched him measure 3 gaps in silence. Why 8? Because 8 is where air moves through, but rain does not pool. My father tested it. She held out her hand. "Let me try." By midday, all 4 children were measuring together, and the orc boys had stopped calling him Soft Tooth. Gruka watched from the kitchen window. Something in her posture softened, the way a rope eases when the knot proves it will hold. Shaman Rukvan returned exactly when he had promised, 3 weeks after his first visit. He read every page of the ledger before speaking. He traced the numbers with one long finger, comparing morning temperatures to evening temperatures, firewood consumed to firewood consumed, hay fed to milk collected. He studied the moisture readings from the bedding. He counted the entries where Aaron had written, "Trough open, no ice." At last, he closed the ledger. "I would not call it proven," he said, "but the numbers are doing what they should." Then he reached into his belt pouch and drew out the knuckle bones again. Gruka watched. Doran stood to one side with his arms folded. The bones scattered across the table and came to rest in a pattern that Rukvan studied for a long time without blinking. "The hand is still here," he murmured. "The bones are no longer uncertain, but they are not yet ready to declare what they see." He gathered the knuckle bones back into the pouch and looked directly at Doran. "I do not believe your system will work." Doran answered without offense. "You should not. Not until it does." Rukvan rose from the table. Before leaving, he made one more request. He pointed toward the pipe where the water line passed through the exterior wall of the barn. "That crossing is exposed. Cold will find it. It could become a bridge for frost to travel into the system." "I will box it with dry wool and wood," Doran replied. Rukvan nodded once. Then he paused at the door and looked back at Gruka. "He speaks like a man who builds for what is coming, not for what has already passed. That is not nothing." He was gone before either of them could respond. Later that same afternoon, Gruka sat across from Doran, with the knucklebone reading still hanging in the air between them. "In orc tradition," she said, "when a stranger lives and works within a hold for more than one turning of the moon, the shaman offers the bond oath. It is a blood contract. The stranger cuts his palm, the hold keeper cuts hers, and the blood is mixed over the hearthstone. After that, the stranger belongs to the hold. He cannot leave without permission. He cannot be expelled without cause. His debts become the hold's debts. His crimes become the hold's crimes." Doran listened without interrupting. "Rukvan will offer you the bond oath when he returns," Gruka continued. "It is tradition. He will expect me to accept." "And will you?" Gruka met his eyes. "No, The answer surprised him. Why not? Because the bond oath is the weapon of fear, not trust. It binds a man to a place by making the cost of leaving greater than the cost of staying. That is not loyalty. That is a cage dressed in ceremony. She placed both hands flat on the table. You will stay here as a free man, Doran Ashvane, or you will leave as one. I will not chain you to this hold with blood and tradition just to keep my walls standing. Doran was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was lower than before. I have never heard an orc refuse a bond oath. Then you have not met enough orcs. Something shifted between them in that moment. It was not dramatic. There was no declaration and no embrace. But Doran looked at Gruka, the way a man looks at someone he has just discovered is larger on the inside than anything he had estimated from the outside. And Gruka met his gaze without blinking, because she had just told him exactly who she was, and she did not intend to explain it twice. The first true cold snap arrived 3 days later, dropping the temperature to 12 degrees above zero by dawn. It was the first honest test of everything they had built together. The old barn had once struggled to hold above 19 degrees on cold days, with drafts crossing the floor and moisture building in the corners. Now, behind the bone wall and the offset entrance, the milk barn held steady between 30 and 33 degrees whenever the inner doors stayed closed. The house burned only 5 armloads of firewood instead of 7. The bedding remained dry. The hay beneath the raised crib smelled clean. Then the water stopped. The buried lime remained open, but the metal coupling beside the trough froze solid overnight. Rukvan had been right. The pipe where it crossed from the buried line into the open air had become a cold bridge, a channel for frost to travel inward and lock the system shut. Doran grabbed a hand axe and broke the ice away from the coupling. I missed it, he said. There was no excuse in his voice, no explanation, just the flat acknowledgement of a man who understands that the gap between knowing something could fail and preventing the failure is where most damage lives. Together, he and Gruka lowered the drain valve, built a small wooden box around the exposed coupling, packed it with dry wool waste, wrapped the outside in tarred hide, and left enough airspace inside to prevent moisture from collecting. They worked until nearly midnight, their breath rising in pale clouds under the lantern light. Gruka walked out carrying 2 tin cups filled with hot chicory brew. Doran accepted, one without lifting his eyes from the coupling. I told you I would fix this hold, he said. You did. The water still froze. Gruka blew across the steam before taking a slow sip. You promised to fix it. You never promised to guess right the first time. The words stayed with him longer than the warmth of the cup. The next morning, they filled the trough again. The water flowed cleanly. When the cattle finished drinking, the line emptied itself exactly as planned, and the coupling stayed clear. For the first time since arriving at Kaltgor, Doran understood something that had nothing to do with pipes or insulation or wind angles. Gruka was not measuring him by whether he ever failed. She was measuring him by whether he was still standing next to the failure when the sun came up. That afternoon, the valley delivered a different kind of pressure. War Chief Drak Ironfang rode into Kaltgor with 2 of his warriors flanking him. He did not dismount. He spoke from the saddle, looking down at Gruka with the practiced ease of a man who had spent his entire life looking down at things. "When the real snow comes," he said, "my freight road closes. No supplies move through the valley without my wagons. I will keep the road open for Kaltgor on one condition. Sign your spring water rights over to my herd." "No," Gruka answered. Drak tilted his head. "A few cold nights are not winter, Stone Marrow. When the howling comes, you will wish you had friends with roads." Doran said nothing while Drak was present. After the war chief rode away, he asked only one question. How many days of hay if his road stays closed? 19 by the old numbers, Gruka replied. Longer if the ledger is right. Doran studied the gray sky in the northwest, where low clouds were beginning to stack against the mountain ridges in long, dark bands. We prepare for 26. Without another word, Gruka opened the ledger, wrote the number 26 beneath the last entry, and drew a single line beneath it. From that moment forward, Kaltgor Hold would prepare for the winter they hoped would never come. The sky began changing. 3 days before the storm arrived, at midday, the oldest milk cow turned her back to the northwest wind and refused to graze. The air thickened. Low clouds stretched across the valley in bands, so dark they looked bruised. Just before sunset, the wind died without warning. The silence that followed was worse than any sound. Doran and Gruka stopped talking about improvements. They prepared for survival. Marker posts went into the frozen ground every 18 paces. The cistern was filled. Hay repositioned. Every lashing on the bone wall checked and tightened. Milk cows moved behind the offset entrance. A guide rope tied from the house to the barn. A repair bag waited beside the door. Iran watched the last marker post go in. Why do we need both the rope and the posts? Doran tightened a knot. A rope keeps a man from drifting. Posts tell him whether he is still going somewhere. Gruka found an old stake bearing Braug's maker's mark and drove it into the first position nearest the house. Doran reinforced the repair bag with Selah's leather strap. Nothing useful from either life was left behind. Near dusk, a warning arrived from Rukvan. An Arctic front was pushing south. Winds could exceed anything the valley had seen in a generation. Once the snow began, no living thing should leave shelter. Everything that could be prepared had been prepared. The howling arrived before dawn. The first blast came from the northwest, exactly as Doran had predicted. The bone wall shuddered, but held. Snow gathered against its outer face, where it was supposed to gather, well away from the barn doors. The offset entrance broke the direct force of the wind before it could reach the cattle. The cistern stayed open beneath its stone cover. The trough filled, drained, and the coupling remained clear. Behind Selah's canvas curtain, the sleeping room held its warmth like a closed fist. Doran and Gruka crossed between the house and the barn, one at a time, each clipped to the guide rope with a leather harness. By midday, the first marker post had vanished beneath the drifting snow. The next one still showed its fluttering cloth strip above the white surface, a small flag of defiance against the storm's attempt to erase every landmark. By the second night, the temperature had dropped so far that the air itself seemed to harden. The wind did not gust. It pressed. It leaned against the walls of the hold, like a living creature testing the strength of a cage. And then, beneath the howl of the storm, a different sound rose from the darkness beyond the bone wall. Low, sustained, hungry. Warg calls, Doran was on his feet before the second howl reached the barn. The cattle shifted and stamped, their eyes wide, their breath coming in sharp, panicked bursts. Through the narrow gap beside the offset entrance, he could see nothing but swirling white. But the sound was closer than it should have been. The storm had driven the pack south, and hunger had driven them past the point of caution. A heavy body hit the outer fence. Wood cracked. Gruka appeared beside him, with the war axe in both hands, her broken tusks bared against the cold. Haran pressed himself against the wall behind them, holding Nessa tight against his chest, the baby's cry swallowed by the roar of the wind. The wargs were at the gate. Doran did not think. He moved. He grabbed 2 bundles of dry straw from the reserve stack and hurled them through the offset entrance into the open snow beyond the gate. Before the wind could scatter them, he struck flint against the iron head of the hand axe and lit the nearest bundle. The flame erupted sideways in the gale, wild and orange, throwing shadows that leaped across the drifts like living things. A second later, he lit the other. Then he seized the 2 largest iron pots from the barn wall, the ones Gruka used for mixing feed supplements, and began hammering them together above his head with the full force of both arms. The sound was enormous, a crashing metallic roar that cut through the wind and the howling and the white noise of the storm like a blade through cloth. Gruka understood instantly. She planted herself at the gate with the war axe raised in both hands, her boots set wide against the ice, blocking the only opening. She did not swing. She did not need to. The fire, the noise, and the silhouette of an orc woman standing in a doorway with a weapon were enough. The first warg, a massive gray shape with frost matted into its fur, skidded to a halt 6 paces from the gate. Its yellow eyes caught the firelight and held it. Behind it, 3 more shapes circled in the darkness, their bodies low, their breath steaming through bared teeth. Doran kept hammering. The pots rang out across the valley like a war drum. Inside the barn, Aaron pressed Nessa tight against his chest, one hand covering her ear, the other braced against the wall. He did not cry. He did not move. He held the baby and watched the fire through the crack in the door. And his face was the face of a child who has decided that if the world is going to be frightening, he will be frightened and still standing at the same time. The lead warg turned. It snapped once at the air, a gesture of frustration more than threat, then wheeled and vanished into the storm. The others followed, one by one, until the only sound left was the wind and the dying crackle of the straw fires, and the steady ringing echo of iron fading into the dark. Gruka lowered the axe. Her arms trembled, but her grip did not. Doran set the pots down. His hands were bleeding where the cold metal had torn the skin. He looked at Gruka through the swirling snow, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "Not bad," Gruka said at last. "For a man with no tusks." Doran almost smiled. Almost. The storm howled on through the 3rd day without mercy. Late that afternoon, a dull pounding echoed from somewhere beyond the bone wall. It was not the wind. It was not the wogs. It was something irregular and desperate, the sound of a fist striking wood. Doran followed the guide rope to the farthest visible marker post and found a body half buried in the drift beside it. The horse was gone. The man's cheeks were white with frostbite, and his lips had turned the color of old slate. He was an orc, broad-shouldered and heavy, and the crest branded into his leather shoulder guard belonged to Drock Ironfang's warband. It was Garn, the same warrior who had ridden beside Drak to mock the bone wall weeks earlier. "I saw the cloth," Garn whispered through cracked lips. His eyes were barely open. One hand still gripped the marker post. "That is why I kept walking." Doran carried him inside without saying a word about irony or justice, or the cost of laughter. He simply dragged the larger man across the snow, clipped them both to the guide rope, and hauled him through the offset entrance into the warmth of the barn. When Garn woke beside the stove hours later, wrapped in every spare blanket the hold owned, he spoke between slow, shallow breaths. "Drak's north barn. The wind is blowing straight through it. The cattle are packed into one corner, crushing each other. They are still trying to reach the water trough, but the line is frozen solid, and no one can get to it." No one in the room answered. There was nothing to say that the facts had not already said. Garn's eyes drifted to the canvas curtain hanging between the rooms, the one stitched by a dead woman's hands in a field camp years before this hold existed. He had laughed at the bone wall. He had called Doran a wandering soft skin. Now the same system he had dismissed, the markers, the cloth strips, the wall that slowed the wind instead of stopping it, had carried him out of a death he would have walked straight into if the post had not been there. He closed his eyes and said nothing more. The storm did not care about gratitude or redemption. It simply tightened. Before dawn on the third day, the oldest milk cow, a broad-hipped animal called Dura, who had survived more winters than anyone could count, went into labor weeks too early. Gruka took one look at the way the cow was straining and knew something was wrong. The calf was turned. Amos the bone setter, the human animal healer who served ranches across Grimfang Valley, could not reach them. The snow had buried every road and trail. There would be no help beyond the people already standing inside this barn. Gruka washed her hands with warm water from the stove kettle, tied Dura's tail aside with a clean strip of cloth, and worked slowly with the calving straps exactly the way Amos had shown her 2 summers ago. She found the calf's front legs, repositioned them with steady pressure, and began the pull. Aaron held the lantern. His hands shook so badly the light danced across the straw-covered floor. "Look at her eyes," Gruka said softly. "Not at the blood. Her eyes." He obeyed. Doran returned from checking the water line just as the final pull was needed. He knelt beside the cow without a word and braced Dura's flank while Gruka drew the calf forward. The calf slid onto the dry straw in a rush of fluid and silence. It did not breathe. Gruka cleared its mouth with 2 fingers. Doran rubbed its ribs with clean straw, working in firm, circular motions. Without being asked, Aaron placed a dry towel into Gruka's outstretched hand, anticipating the need before anyone spoke it. For one terrible, endless moment, nothing happened. Then the calf drew its first breath. It was a small sound, a gasp that was barely louder than the wind pressing against the barn walls. But it stopped every person in the room, as completely as if the world itself had paused to listen. From the house, Nessa began to cry. Garn, still weak and wrapped in blankets beside the stove, pulled the unfinished cradle closer to the heat and warmed another bottle of milk with unsteady hands. He moved slowly, carefully, the way a man moves when he is discovering that strength and gentleness are not opposite things, but the same thing measured at different scales. No one stood outside the work anymore. The dry bedding kept the newborn off the frozen floor. The offset entrance held the wind outside the calving stall. Running water made clean hands possible. The lantern hanging in the widened passage kept the cattle calm. Every system Doran had built and every repair they had made together converged on this single moment. A birth that should not have survived the night, but did, because the ground beneath it had been prepared. Aran finally let out the breath he had been holding since the calf fell into the straw. The third afternoon brought the hardest wind of the entire storm. Just past midday, one of the lashings on the north section of the bone wall snapped with a sound like a whip. Crack. The woven panel of willow and rib began shaking violently, slamming against its frame with each gust. If it failed completely, the wind would pour straight through the offset passage, and within hours, drifting snow would seal the barn entrance shut, with the cattle still inside. Doran reached for the rope. Gruka caught the other end without a word. Outside, the storm erased everything beyond the next marker post. Doran crawled from stake to stake, pulling himself forward on his elbows and knees. One post had already snapped. The loose willow lattice slammed into him as he reached the broken section, knocking him flat into the drift. His repair bag burst open, and tools scattered across the snow. Only Selah's old leather strap, the one he had used to reinforce the bag before the storm, kept it from blowing away entirely. He dragged himself upright, gathered what he could find by feel alone, and braced the broken section with a spare pole, setting it diagonally across the frame, instead of trying to rebuild the wall. It did not need to last forever. It needed to last until morning. When the work was done, the rope grew still. Gruka pulled, hand over hand, slowly, steadily, until a figure crawled out of the white darkness on one arm and one knee. Doran pushed himself to his feet. His face was raw. His hands were bleeding again. Ice clung to his beard and his eyebrows and the seams of his coat. "It will hold until morning," he said. Gruka looked past him into the storm, still raging across the valley, with the mindless fury of something that does not know how to stop. Morning is enough. By the fourth dawn, the wind had finally begun to weaken. No one celebrated. They counted. Every animal was still alive. The newborn calf carried only a small patch of frostbite on one ear. The bedding remained dry. Water still flowed through the trough, and the coupling stayed clear. The hay crib showed no heat, no mold, no spoilage. The barn doors opened without digging through snow. Firewood still stood stacked beside the stove. Garn was on his feet. Doran walked the hold with a notebook instead of relief. He recorded every weakness the storm had revealed. One brace had been too light. 2 marker posts needed to be set deeper. The outer cloth strips required stronger stitching. The wooden cover over the water coupling needed a better roof. Gruka watched him writing. "You have counted every weakness before you have counted what survived." Doran closed the notebook. What survived can wait an hour. A weakness should never be allowed to hide behind a success. Later, the clouds split just enough to reveal a strip of pale gray sky. Steam rose from the cattle as they breathed into the cold air, and for the first time in 4 days, the silence that followed the wind felt like mercy instead of threat. When the roads finally opened, people came to Kalt Gor Hold for answers instead of rumors. Shaman Rukfan arrived first, riding his ash-colored mule through the half-cleared drifts. Amos the bone setter followed on foot, his medicine pack slung over one shoulder. Then came neighboring clan holders who had spent the past 4 days digging cattle from snowdrifts and counting their dead. Rukvan inspected everything without hurry. He checked the barn temperature with the back of his hand pressed against the interior wall. He felt the bedding. He examined the water system, tracing the pipe from the well to the trough and back. He counted the surviving cattle. He measured the remaining hay against the number of days the storm had lasted. He read every page of the ledger. From the first entry Aaron had written 3 weeks before the storm, to the last numbers recorded during the worst night. At last, he closed the book. "The barn stayed drier than any hold in this valley," he said. "The herd burned less feed than expected. Stable water made the difference between calm cattle and panicked ones. The bone wall stood where the snow wanted to settle, not where the doors needed to open." He paused, and every flaw that showed itself early was corrected before the howling arrived. Garn spoke next. He was still moving stiffly, and his cheeks bore the dark marks of healing frostbite. But he stood on his own feet and spoke in a voice that carried no irony and no pride. Only the plain weight of a debt he would spend the rest of his life understanding. "I would be dead if those marker posts had not been there." Then Rukvan did something no one expected. He reached into his belt pouch and drew out the knuckle bones, one final time, but instead of casting them in private, he knelt in the open yard where every visitor could see. The bones scattered across the frozen ground in front of Gruka, Doran, the neighboring clan holders, Amos, and Garn. Rukvan studied the pattern in silence. The wind had died, and the valley was so quiet that the click of the bones against the earth was the loudest sound for miles. When he looked up, his voice carried the weight of something older than opinion. "The first time I cast these bones on this land, they were uncertain. A stranger's hand was on this hold, and the spirits could not say whether it carried fortune or ruin." He rose slowly to his feet. "I do not cast uncertain bones twice without reason. Today they speak clearly." He looked at Doran. "The hand that was once foreign to this place has become part of it. It is no longer a stranger's hand. It is the hand of the hold itself." Silence spread across the yard. The neighboring orcs looked at one another. One of them, an old clan holder whose fence lines bordered Kaltgor to the south, nodded once and said nothing more. Among orcs, the shaman's bone reading was not a suggestion. It was a verdict delivered by forces that could not be argued with, bribed, or appealed. Doran Ashvane, a human soldier with no tusks and no bloodline, had just been declared part of this land by the only authority every clan in Grimfang Valley recognized without question. Gruka's face did not change, but her broken tusks caught the pale winter light, and for the first time since Bralg's death, the grief they carried looked like it was sharing space with something else. Drock Ironfang came last. His ranch had lost cattle. Part of his north barn roof had been ripped away by the wind. He offered no apology and no acknowledgement of how close Garn had come to dying on his watch. He simply looked at the bone wall still standing despite its patched north section and spoke in a voice stripped of everything except the need to know. "How far did you set it from the barn?" 34 paces through the middle," Doran answered. "Then we adjusted for the slope and the ground composition. And the weave is never tight enough to stop the wind completely. It only needs to take the force out." Drock nodded once. "Show me." Doran walked beside him, across the snow, past the marker posts and the mended section and the offset entrance, explaining every decision without boasting, and every failure without excusing. They walked for a long time. When they returned, Drock mounted his horse without comment. But as he gathered the reins, he looked at Gruka one last time. Your builder knows what he is doing. It was not an apology, it was not friendship, but from Drock Ironfang, it was the closest thing either would ever receive. Later that afternoon, after every visitor had gone, and the hold had settled back into its own quiet, Gruka led Doran into the small room she used as an office. She placed a folded agreement on the desk. The hide was clean, and the ink was careful. It granted Doran a share of the hold's earnings, authority over water systems, structural work, and winter preparation. A voice in decisions that affected the land and the livestock. One final line stood apart from the rest, written in a different hand, larger and more deliberate than the others. Aaron and Nessa will always have a home at Kultgore Hold, regardless of what happens between the two adults who share it. Doran looked up. Why would you give me part of something that has always belonged to you? Gruka met his eyes without hesitation. I am not giving you what was mine. She turned the agreement gently toward him. I am naming what you already carried. That evening, after the agreement had been signed and the ink had dried, Doran and Gruka sat beside the stove, while the hold settled into its first quiet night since the howling. The fire burned low. Neither of them hurried to fill the silence. At last, Doran looked into his cup. I came here begging for milk. I did not plan on owing anyone a life. Gruka rested both hands around her coffee. You do not owe me one, but there is one here, if you mean to share it. Doran was quiet for a long time. Then he spoke without looking up. I will stay until the snow is gone. Stay until the grass comes back. He lifted his eyes. Longer than that. They did not marry the moment the roads cleared. The work came first, as it always did. In the weeks that followed, they rebuilt the damaged north section of the bone wall and reinforced every joint and lashing. Under Doran's guidance, neighboring holds across Grimfang Valley began adopting what people had started calling the Kultgore Winter Plan. Raised hay cribs, drained water lines, offset entrances, bone walls set at distance, and marker posts with cloth strips along every critical path. Even Drock Ironfang built a windbreak along his north barn, though he never once credited where the idea came from. It was not until early spring, when the first green shoots appeared between the melting drifts, that Doran and Gruka held a quiet ceremony. Rukvan spoke the old words. Amos, the bone setter, served as witness. The celebration lasted only long enough to share bread and salt, because Dura was calving again, and the fence on the south pasture needed mending before the thaw loosened the posts. Drock never attended, but the next morning, a neat bundle of straight willow stakes appeared beside the hold's front gate, cut clean and tied with leather cord. No note, no name, but the stakes were the finest quality in the valley, and everyone knew whose land grew willows that straight. A few days after the ceremony, Aaron looked up from the ledger, where he was recording the morning temperature. His handwriting steadier now than it had been the first time he held the pencil. Do I have to call you something different now? Gruka set a fresh cup of milk on the table beside him. You never have to call me anything you do not truly mean. Aaron nodded. Gruka, he said, testing the name the way it had always sounded. She smiled. For her, that was enough. But weeks later, while running along the path between the marker posts, Aaron tripped over a half-buried stone and went sprawling across the mud. Before he had even stopped sliding, the word came out of him like a reflex, pulled from somewhere deeper than thought. Ma Gruka. She was already running toward him before the second syllable landed. She knelt beside him, brushed the dirt from his palms, checked his knees, and pressed her thumb gently against the scrape on his chin, all without acknowledging the word he had almost finished saying. Aaron looked up at her with mud on his face and something raw and unguarded in his eyes. She met his gaze, smiled, and helped him stand. Neither of them mentioned it again. Neither of them needed to. Spring slowly returned to Grimfang Valley. Beside the barn post, where Aaron had carved the season's final snow line, little Nessa pulled herself upright against the fence rail and took 3 careful, unsteady steps across the yard toward Gruka. Her arms were stretched forward, her legs wobbled. Her face carried the fierce concentration of someone attempting something that matters more than balance. Ma, the tiny voice drifted across the yard. Gruka did not rush forward. She simply knelt, planted both hands on her knees, and waited for the girl to finish the last 2 steps on her own. Doran watched from the far end of the corral. His eyes moved slowly from Messa's small figure to the repaired bone wall, to the open barn doors, to the cattle grazing calmly in the south pasture, to the cistern reflecting the first blue sky in months. He let out a slow breath. It still needs fixing, he said. Gruka lifted Nessa onto her hip and walked toward him, pulling the second tin cup from beside the stove on her way past the door. She pressed it into his hand. Good, she said. You told me you would stay as long as there was work. Kaltgor Hold did not survive because winter showed mercy. Winter showed none. It survived because every weakness was found and fixed before the storm could use it. The hay was lifted. The water was buried. The wind was slowed. The entrance was turned. The markers were planted. And when the bone wall broke, someone crawled into the dark to hold it together until morning. Doran and Gruka never rescued each other. They simply stopped mistaking loneliness for strength. He arrived asking for milk and offered his hands. She gave the milk first and judged the hands later. Between those 2 choices, a life took root in frozen ground and held. And out here, on the frontier, where orc and human had been taught by the world to distrust each other, that single lesson, that the door you open for a stranger might be the same door that saves your house, would endure far longer than any winter the valley had ever known. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to Orkheart Saga for more stories like this one, and leave a comment telling us your favorite moment. We read every single one.